Bored of too many ads and dull, meaningless chat? We've got neither. Joy Drive. Smart, fun radio. Theatre, film, TV and more. Suzy Rong reviews it all on Joy Drive.
Good afternoon, Suzy Rong.
Good afternoon, Warren. Are you ever a nostalgic sort of person?
Oh, I love nostalgia. I find it so fascinating. History and nostalgia really do. Yourself?
I think I'm more of a futurist.
Oh, okay. We're at opposite ends.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Actually, I'm a bit surprised about that.
Oh, really? I love it. It's interesting. I was a real science and maths student, but the one sort of humanities subject that I loved was history at school. I loved it. I found it so fascinating.
So do you think about the good old days, or do you just think about history? I think they're a bit different.
No, I don't think of the good old days, I suppose. No, you're right, in terms of nostalgia. It's more, I like historical things. I like finding out what happened and how far we've come and what we've learnt from it. So it's not a longing for the past, although there are some things I suppose I would, but it's just a general appreciation of historical things. I feel like we overlook history a lot and we repeat it.
Yeah. Whenever war happens, we can see how we repeat things.
Definitely. But today we are talking about something, I suppose, that happened in the past. It is While the Men Are Away, which is on SBS On Demand. Suzy, before you tell us about it, I'm really proud. I completed the whole season. Good
for you. Do you want a badge for that?
Yes, please. What do I get? You're gonna get that
it is the
riding whip off your
1940s. Let me do my job. It is the 1940s, and the world is at war once again. In the new SBS comedy series While the Men Are Away, Gwen and Esther join the Australian Women's Land Army and are sent to Bush, a rural farming community, to assist the Whitmore family with their apple plantation. As luck would have it, the woman in charge, Mrs. Frankie Whitmore, is a closeted lesbian whose presence on the estate helps Gwen, one of the volunteers, to understand her own burgeoning homosexuality. Farmhand Robert is one of the few men left in town, and it seems he too is a secret queer who helps Esther, the other new arrival, to expand her sexual horizons. Yes, While the Men Are Away is raunchy with several memorable and fairly high-level sex scenes, although everything is done with a comical edge. The series is beautifully shot, featuring gorgeous costumes and scenery. The story is well conceived. It is clear that very smart and modern brains are behind its creation, but I never really connected with any of its characters, and it won't surprise you that mid-century farm life is certainly not of any interest to me. While the Men Are Away consists of 8 parts, with each episode coming in under 30 minutes. It is not a long series by any measure, but there are a lot of tangents, and I find the narratives keep getting more and more complicated, and frankly, I struggled to keep up with so much going on. I did persist with it though, and can say that overall the show does offer a rewarding experience. In many ways, While the Men Are Away is inventive and original. It tries to look at Australian heritage with a critical eye, taking into account not only queer perspectives, but is also conscious of bringing a certain renewed dignity to the portrayal of Indigenous lives. There is an admirable feminist spirit that informs all aspects of the filmmaking, but maybe just not amusing enough to make it a real hit. Warren, I know you weren't alive in the 40s, but maybe you had an easier time with this sort of vintage Australiana than I did.
I think I might have. There's a lot of munching in it, Suzy, though I will say that, and you have to watch it to see what we're talking about. I thought, it's important to note, I started watching it, I didn't like it because if I watch something that is set in a period, I like it to be historically accurate, give or take a little bit, and this certainly isn't by any stretch of the imagination. At first I was a bit annoyed, but I think once I accepted that and thought, okay, that's what this series is going to be like, I kind of enjoyed watching it. There were things, for example, like they do a lockdown. Now, as far as I know, these particular lockdowns didn't happen during World War II. I could be factually incorrect there, but I couldn't find any information on it. And I just thought it was kind of a bit of an obvious attempt to connect those of us who all went through the lockdown of COVID to what it was like during a lockdown during World War II because of some escaped prisoners. I didn't like that. I thought that was a bit silly. I found the ending really confusing, Suzy. I don't really know what happened at the end. Everything got wrapped up really, really quickly. I don't know. And one thing that did annoy me about it was the radio voice. It was so fake, and they were wirelesses back then. They weren't radios. So
I did find a lot of it confusing, and I thought, I have to take partial responsibility for it, maybe. I'm guilty, like everyone else, of having multiple screens turned on while watching a thing, and I did try to focus a bit on it, but I did find myself just unable to get on track with what was happening, and there were so many things happening. But the point of departure, I think, is great. Obviously when the men are away, women have a little bit more freedom. We've talked for many years about how women during wartime were doing a great job of keeping their respective countries operating. They went to the workforce, they did really well, and then obviously subsequently they went back into their homes in the 50s. But we're comfortable with talking about women going to work, but we're not comfortable about talking women from the past, having sexual relations with one another, whether it's in the absence of men or whatever reason. We just kind of are not comfortable talking about our mothers and grandmothers possibly being queer women.
That is true. But I just think some of the terminology that comes across is today's terminology, and it's overlaid over this period in the 1940s. And to me, it didn't quite match up as to what it would have been like. But overall, I have to admit, I did enjoy watching it. I have to give it a bit of a tick because I watched it to the end, Suzy, and yesterday I went home and I thought, I've got about 3 episodes to go. I want to finish it. I want to see what happened. So it wasn't that bad as much as we're criticising it. There were some interesting concepts there, and that is, what happens when those in power, I suppose being the men at this time, are removed or taken away, and do we fall back to being our authentic selves? And I thought that was really nice how that happened. It was quite, it's quite powerful, isn't it? That existing structure is suppressing what is considered, unacceptable, immoral, or revolting at the time, and you remove it.
And they portrayed women taking over in a very modern way, but also it gave us a look into how women kind of are more comfortable with collaborative collaboration. We kind of don't require so much of a up-down power structure, and that was good to see. And you're right, a lot of the language and a lot of the concepts are really, really modern,
very modern.
Which on one hand I really appreciated, but it does make things a little bit hard to believe. It makes the story a little bit hard to get into the way they speak and the way they think. I think we want a bit more of, they had these sort of really parochial neighbors, who were horrible and really nasty, and you almost want a bit more of that, a bit more realism in the story, perhaps. But most of the time, we were just with these really modern women, and while they were good examples, I think dramatically maybe it wasn't too involving.
And I suppose those nasty neighbours, I'm sure that's what they were like, but they were sort of made to be a little bit over the top to try and be comical, but it wasn't funny. It didn't quite cross that line, and I think that's what you alluded to in your review about it. It just didn't get me laughing. It definitely didn't get me laughing. We're talking about While the Men Are Away, which you can catch on SBS On Demand. But I tell you something it did do, Suzy. It pricked my interest in what secret rainbow communities were like during World War II. And I know that this does not reflect what it was necessarily like, but I want to know a little bit more about it, and it might be something that we make some inquiries about with perhaps the Queer Archives, who are here in the building at the Pride Centre. But it certainly got me interested in what it was like during World War II, being queer.
Yeah, it shows the importance of filmmaking for this sort of discussions. Now, I've been doing this segment with you for 2 years now, can you believe it? And over this time, we've had a few opportunities to talk about some American films, especially documentaries that deal with the queer past. sort of excavating those histories and then kind of understanding where our rainbow community comes from. I think America has been really good at doing that sort of work all these decades, but in Australia, we don't really have that much information that far back. We are probably good at talking about the emergence of Mardi Gras, but that didn't happen until the late 70s, which feels like a completely different era from the 40s and before that.
It's interesting, the character Robert, who was a conscientious objector in the series, and it's interesting, isn't it, during these times where our nationalistic pride is called upon, there's absolutely no tolerance for any difference of opinion, is there? It's completely overridden, and I could see how back in the 40s, this idea of Australian mateship and the culture, it's so deep-rooted in our history, isn't it, that no wonder it's hard for queer people during times of difficulty or even at school. It's just so deep-rooted in our whole culture.
Yeah, the way we insist on people conforming, it's terrifying. I think for those of us who grew up as queer kids, we understand this feeling, like it is such a threat. Like we are threatened, and then we are presented as threats to their ways of thinking, as though like we are such. Well, I guess we are disruptors to their ways of living. But I think in the best ways. But they're so terrified of what we introduce to their values, and I guess when you go back into these old stories, you can see that more clearly.
And where it comes from. Look, I'm glad I watched it. I'd encourage people to give it a go. It's called While the Men Are Away. It's on SBS On Demand. Paul from Murray Bridge says, the show was written terribly and I watched it for 15 minutes until I switched to another streaming service. And a bit of a unhappy face there, Suzy. That's from Paul from Murray Bridge. So,
look, I want to say that we often criticize Australian films as being very formulaic. We always say that Australian films are, seen before and are very predictable. This is not one of those. No. This is, I feel, trying to do something new. And in the process, I think it makes it a little bit hard for many of us to get into it. I'm sure there'll be people who enjoy it. I'm sure of that. But because you and I are not lesbians, so maybe it's a little bit talking outside of who this show probably will speak closer to. But we really need to pay attention to programming that's original and brave, and this is certainly one of it.
And big tick for the diversity in the cast.
Yeah, like they've tried, obviously this story takes place in the 40s, and in our imagination, Australia was extremely white. But, they've got a big indigenous story in there, and then there's a bit of an Asian family in there that is pretty interesting. So those are good efforts to introduce racial diversity.
So give it a go. It's called While the Men Are Away. It's on SBS On Demand. Suzy Wrong, what's homework for next week?
Never Let Him Go is a 4-part documentary series on Disney Plus about the gay murders that happened in Sydney in the late 1980s. So that's more history for us when I see you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Suzy. Catch you next Tuesday.
Joy Drive on Joy 94.9 FM in Melbourne, Joy on your digital radio, iHeartRadio, TuneIn.com or the Joy app. No matter where you are,